Thank you so much, Bob. And I want to say welcome to the audience, wherever they are tuning in from. I'm Professor Deepa Ollapally. I teach international relations at George Washington University. I also run a program there called the Rising Powers Initiative that focuses on big countries in Asia like India, China, Japan, and including Russia, looking at their foreign policy debates to bring a variety of views into Washington, which I think sometimes we miss here. My main area of interest and research has been on Indian foreign policy, U.S.-India relations, and India-China relations. And recently, I've been publishing and working on maritime issues in the Indo-Pacific, focusing a lot on China and India. I have 5 books that I've written. I'm sorry, I'm giving my own introduction here. So I have to, I don't like touting myself, but 5 books. And I'm working on a new book that looks at big power competition in the Indian Ocean. And so all of these major topics that we're going to be talking about today is part of it, even though we're now going to be talking about the land dispute, land boundary issues, but they're all interlinked. And so thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my views.
Absolutely. We're thrilled to be with you today, and thanks to everyone for joining as well. So just to start at the very bottom, I imagine everybody joining this has already read something that's gone on in India and China, but can you summarize for all those tuning in how and why it came to be that the border between India and China is ambiguous? The idea of an ambiguous border, I think, is very foreign to at least North Americans, but I think Europe for much of the past 50 years is just kind of taken for granted that the borders are pretty known. So yeah, how did that dispute?
Okay, well, it's a big question, but let me tackle it by saying that China is one of the countries with a large number of neighboring countries with borders that it shares, 14. And let me begin by noting that 13 of those borders have been settled, land borders, that is, not maritime. So that leaves the Indo-Chinese border as the only one that has not been settled. So that's the one thing to note right away. And it's not a short one. It is 2,167 miles long, and it covers a long mountainous and very, very difficult terrain across the Himalayas. And generally speaking, there are 3 sort of sectors to that: the western, the middle, and the eastern sectors. And you kind of have to, and right now what is happening, the clashes that are taking place is in the western sector, way up in the Himalayas. Why is it so ambiguous? Because the British, we have to go back to the British here, they get a little blame. Their demarcation and their understandings and agreements were often not acceptable to China. So right now what you have is neither independence, neither India nor China reached an understanding of where their boundaries lay. But in 1962, they fought a war in the exact same spot that they're clashing in right now, by the way, in the Galwan area, in the Aksai Chin. And what happened is that at that point, China grabbed what is now the Aksai Chin part of the border area, and that is under Chinese control. And that has been so what you have now is that instead of a boundary settlement, you have what is called a line of sorry. I don't know if you can hear me still. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yep, I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. The line of actual control. In other words, where each of them hold their positions is where they have kind of agreed as the line of actual control. But it has not been delineated on any maps that they agreed to, and it has not been demarcated on any of the ground areas as well, in a way that both fully agree. So on the one hand, China has agreed to the post-colonial borders. As I said, the western sector is the one that we're seeing in a big dispute right now, but the eastern sector also is under dispute. So they just haven't been able to come to an agreement on the line.
So there's a thing I read the other
Bob,
day.
sorry. I think we were having issues with your audio there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
No, Deepa, you're fine. It's Bob is having a little bit of he's cutting out a little bit.
Is it still happening?
Yes, I think so. Deepa, can you hear Bob okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Now.
I can hear you.
Okay, go ahead, Bob.
All right, sorry about that. So what is the prevailing narrative presented in both India and China about the border area? In other words, is the fact that there is an ongoing, albeit normally inconsequential until recently, dispute a commonly discussed fact in either country?
Well, the interesting thing is that on the 1962 war, where China dealt a really heavy blow and defeated a big embarrassing defeat to India, has created a historical memory on the Indian side that runs deep, and everyone knows about that big defeat. And so there is always this overhang of a memory on the Indian side. The Chinese side is much less concerned about that because, well, they see that they won, and it was in many ways, in their view, something that they wanted to teach India a lesson. And so the way in which the narrative on both sides have developed is very, very different. I mean, for China, I think the main peer competitor and the major threat comes from the US. And for India at this point, even though there's you hear India-Pakistan conflict all the time, the Chinese threat also figures pretty prominently. It is kind of up and down depending on what's going on the border, essentially. Also, China's recent forays into South Asia, into India's own neighborhood. So there's a lot more sort of mistrust on the Indian side, I think, than on the Chinese. So there's a kind of asymmetry here. And so, when this conflict erupted, the willingness of the Indian side to listen to the Chinese view of things is very, very, that threshold is very low, in part because, just to get back to the conflict zone for a moment, the Galwan Valley, which is where the actual clash took place, runs along the line of actual control, and it divides up the Chinese Aksai Chin and Indian Ladakh. And so India was building a road that runs along the valley, along the river, that is now given it access to an airstrip in a remote area, and now it becomes a much greater challenge to China. So the other thing that I think has really inflamed the Indian opinion in a way that it didn't until now is the fact that this is the first time there's been loss of life. 20 Indian soldiers. We don't know whether and how many Chinese troops were casualty, because we haven't heard anything from the Chinese side. And also the fact that, one of the ways in which they've handled this line of actual control without it getting out of hand since 1975 is the fact that they do not carry weapons along the border. So up to now, it is mostly throwing rocks and hurling insults at each other. And suddenly you have this situation where the Chinese side apparently had used clubs with barbed wire and nails and so forth, and fought the Indians. So that leaves, I think, a kind of a bitter taste there now. So.
Yeah, that sounds pretty intense indeed. I mean, clubs with barbed wire. I actually hadn't heard that detail of the event. I read the other day that India has tried to show China its version of the map. Like, here's what we think the line should be. And China won't even officially state what their claim is. They won't do the same. Is this true? And why do you think China does this? If it's true.
First, as I said to begin with, that there is no real agreement on the border in terms of their common agreement. And so there have been attempts to try to demarcate things along the line of actual control. One of the problems, by the way, is that it is extraordinarily difficult terrain to actually map out. And then once mapped out, to hold and to say, now we've got it. So it's just, most of the stuff is like, right now we're talking about 15,000 feet above. Ridges, narrow ridges. Most of the area is in permafrost. So you're talking about an area that's going to be really difficult under the best of circumstances to do a really close cartographic, come to a close cartographic agreement. But in the past, they have had exchange of maps, but on the western sector, as I said, there are 3 sectors, China has refused to actually give and talk about exchanging maps on the western sector. Now, why is that? Well, they have, one of their suggestions is that we leave aside the disagreement on the border. We don't make, and since 1993, they've had agreements that they do not change the status quo by force. Both sides have agreed. They have mechanisms set up to make sure that they can check if, when you're disengaging, there's what they call a clarification process that they do. But so far, they're not willing to talk about maps, so which makes it very difficult, obviously, to move further.
Sure. It seems to me, I mean, I'm sort of speculating here, to say the least, but it seems to me that one reason to not show your map, as it were, is because if you accrue more leverage in the next 10 or 15 years, why not wait till then? You may be able to ask for more.
Well, good point. In fact, right now, what we're seeing in the Galvan Valley is that up to now, China had not actually contested that one area. And so when India was building its road and up to the airstrip, the idea was that it was in the Indian side of the line of actual control. But now, after this clash, and the fact that India has built this, China is now actually claiming the entire Galvan Valley. And that is the kind of sort of, you maybe nibble away, in a way, in this. And why did it occur right now? Why the contestation? one has to assume that it's because as India is building up its capacity, Chinese are getting alarmed. Because one thing to note is that when you look at the border capability, China is way, way far ahead. And it has been historically the case that China just has much better mountain range troops as well as equipment and so forth. And so it's much better placed. And so India has been far behind, and they've been trying to build up border infrastructure for decades. And since 2015, there's been a step up to that. So I think this having that ambiguity, makes it easier to stake your claim wherever you feel like. And there's a lot of ambiguity also to begin with on the line of actual control, because as I said, no one is, demarcating each and every inch of that really horrible terrain in the best of circumstances. So it leaves a lot of room to disagree.
Yeah, it sounds like so. You've described the land as being permafrost, tundra, ridges at 15,000 feet. Why do they care about this land so much, other than just pure territorial size?
Well, as they say in real estate, it's location, location, location. It's basically that, because it does not, there is no kind of resources out there. There is, most of it is uninhabitable. There's really, and so that's one of the reasons that they had actually left it aside in many ways. The problem is that over the years, the interests have changed on both sides, and this area has become more and more important strategically speaking. What was their interest, 25 years ago versus now is a very different matter. And so you've got, for example, the location is one that has a lot of strategic importance for both countries. For China, it's the Aksai Chin is the road that goes from Xinjiang to Tibet through that. It's very, very important. For India, it's also very close to disputed territory, not only with China, but with Pakistan. So it's sort of a confluence of these sort of disagreements that they haven't come to blows on very often. And that's the thing to keep in mind. However, since about 2014 and the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the things that China has given as a flagship project of the Belt and Road is something called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which I'm sure everybody in the audience is familiar with that. But that project happens to go from China's western frontier right through some of the disputed areas between India and Pakistan, all the way down to the Gwadar port in the Arabian Sea in the Indian Ocean. Now, that India sees as China having violated India's territorial claims in the broader Kashmir dispute. And so, those are sort of what happens is that you have facts on the ground. China is spending $60 billion on that, building a variety of infrastructure and other economic projects along the way. And that is creating a problem for India, because now you've got China very heavily invested in an area that is contested between India and Pakistan. So both sides, and as I said before, in terms of just the capabilities, India is really playing catch up. But as India is catching up, Chinese are now taking note, and unwilling, I think, to sort of countenance that. So that's yeah.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned at I think it was before the session today even officially began. I think you mentioned it in the kind of comments we were having with each other, the maritime, or maybe you mentioned it in your introduction regarding the book you're writing on the maritime issues. We didn't intend to talk about it today, but I feel like it must be acknowledged, at least, if there are any other places than this one area where India and China are clashing on projection of power or, sphere of influence type stuff.
Yeah, and that is actually a very good question. One of the things that, as much as China in many ways has the advantage on the land border, I would say that as of now, India holds a certain strategic premium, if you will, in its Indian Ocean area. And of course, China's sort of jugular, which is the Malacca Strait, because 85% of its energy imports go through that choke point, that happens to be very close to one of India's bases called the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is just several hundred miles from that, and it can threaten Chinese interests in a way that would be really quite significant for the Chinese. I mean, that would be a kind of a knockout punch, if you will. But that, to get to that point, of course, now we're talking very, very, talking kind of sort of fantasy here. But on the other hand, the point remains that China clearly has a certain vulnerability in there, but they haven't been sitting still. And they're doing everything to redress that. And the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is in part an attempt to do that, to avoid having to go all the way to the Malacca Strait. But I think that's going to remain a vulnerability, even down the road. And also, when you think about China's vulnerabilities, it has to face the U.S. and other countries in its own east and south in the maritime regions as well. So both these countries have certain advantages and disadvantages vis-a-vis each other in different theaters of conflict. And I think in this case, whether you can leverage one versus the other, the land versus the maritime, well, to what extent each one is willing to go is, of course, an open question, because no one is really thinking along those lines, because there is this level of pragmatism that's also quite deep in both countries at the moment, I think. But I do think that this border clash has been a big setback, and I would say even maybe a turning point. And it has to do with the fact that two things. One is actual loss of life, and second is the fact that China is not claiming all of that area. And there are different stories about how it came about, the disengagement process. And now, right this moment on Monday, they did meet again to talk, but there are still a lot of problems to be overcome. But yes, the maritime corridor and many of India's neighbors are moving very close to China. So China is gaining certain advantages, politically speaking.
So I'm going to interject on that note, neighbors. We actually had a question from an audience member asking about how Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet feature into this. And in particular, another user asked a similar question, which is, what role has Tibet played in this India border dispute? So yeah, neighbors in the region. And then I'll go ahead and extend the question. Hopefully it doesn't become an unwieldy question, but neighbors also the international community in general, the UN, or the United States for that matter, do international players have a firm perspective on how this should go?
First, on the neighbor question, Tibet is huge in all of this, and historically has been one of the key flashpoints. I mentioned that India and China have an unsettled border in the east sector, and that has to do with the fact that what China calls South Tibet, India calls Arunachal Pradesh one of its states, and it controls it. India controls it, and the problem there is that the Chinese, over time, now if you're thinking about, going back a little bit, there might have been a moment when there might have been a settlement where there was could have been a kind of a swap where China gives up the claims on the eastern side for an Indian giving up a claim on the western side. But that's no longer on the table. One of the reasons is that within Arunachal Pradesh, there is a very important Tibetan Buddhist site called Tawang. It's apparently where the 6th Dalai Lama was born, and the Chinese now claim all of Arunachal Pradesh as well. And I think it's partly because obviously their hold on Tibet, and they don't want to loosen that. And so that is a flashpoint. But so far, that has been much quieter in recent years. There's always, they go back and forth about if the Dalai Lama was allowed to visit Tawang, the Chinese will protest and so forth. But so Tibet it continues to be important, but India has never disputed that Tibet is part of China. In fact, there are some Indian analysts who suggest that maybe India was too generous in that, and it maybe should not have been so quick to do that. As far as Bhutan, Bhutan is again at a tri-junction between India, China, and Bhutan, and it is very, very strategic. Strategic because there is a small corridor. India's mainland is separated from its northeast states by the only access is like a tiny, what they call a chicken's neck, a small, maybe 20-mile wide corridor that connects India to the rest of 44 million people on the northeastern side. The Bhutan junction, the tri-junction, where they had a kind of a showdown between India backing up Bhutan and China standing up against them, was in 2017. That was because China was trying to grab an area that would have looked right down onto that corridor and threatened it. That was a long, they had a standoff there that they finally climbed down, but from the reports that China has actually came back, that they disengaged and that they came back. But we don't know for sure. No one is saying. And finally, Nepal, India, in recent years, first of all, Nepal and India have an open border. You don't need a visa to go from one side to the other. A lot of Nepalis work in India and so forth. However, and they're both Hindu majority states, so one would think that they'd get along. That's not entirely the case. In fact, right now, there's a fracas going on between India and Nepal because of a road that India built that was actually connecting a trading route between India and China. So that's the interesting point, is that Nepal has a problem with that, with both China and India on this. But I think this is more something that probably India will deal with politically, because again, size matters. Nepal is landlocked. Its trade and transit is entirely dependent on India. So, India holds a lot of cards there. But but the China factor is important, as some of these states are now obviously playing the China card vis-a-vis India. And so India is feeling pressured as well.
So do you feel that those neighboring countries are moving closer to China? And then, so there's two things. There's like where they are now, quote unquote, and where they're heading. So they may still
Sorry,
be,
Bob, to interrupt. Your robot voice is back.
Oh, I really don't know what's causing it.
Okay, I can still hear you, Bob.
About now. Okay, well, if you can hear the question, I might have to power through.
Go ahead.
The neighbors diplomatically closest to India or China, and wherever they are on that spectrum, which way are they moving?
Yeah. The Nepal used to be one of India's closest friends, but in recent years, the Communist Party right now that's ruling Nepal has been putting some distance between India and Nepal. India has also been, I think, could have handled some of the disputes between Nepal and India better, including some constitutional issues that I don't need to get into. I think India was probably a little too heavy-handed, frankly. In the case of others, like Sri Lanka, of course, is probably one of the closest to, and I'm leaving aside Pakistan, because clearly we know the story there. But the other neighbors, Sri Lanka is very, very close to China, including the buildup of Chinese buildup of a port, a very strategic port in Hambantota, which is now in Chinese hands for the next 99 years because Sri Lanka could not pay back its debt. And so, this is where actually it is sort of the poster child for the whole idea of debt trap diplomacy that we hear a lot about. Myanmar, of course, was in the past closer to China. Now it is it's being much more skeptical, and so we see some pullback from there. And the Bangladesh, in all of these countries, what is interesting is that none of them really want to have to make a clear-cut choice. Let me put it that way, between India and China. They do not want to be caught in the middle of this tug of war. And they know that ultimately India's core interests are in the neighborhood, and they can't really afford to kind of piss India off too much. On the other hand, they also want to be able to take advantage of Chinese money, but it comes at a certain cost. You don't get a free lunch. And so I think it's going to be difficult for these countries. This conflict between India and China, I think, is going to make it more difficult for the neighborhood because if the tensions really go up, I think they'll do whatever they can to not have to make a choice, but there may be a time that comes sooner rather than later where they may have to do that. And I think both India and China now are going to be probably bearing down even stronger on trying to increase their influence in these countries. And India is trying to do it, in particular, using other countries in the region, like Japan, who also are interested in trying to give an alternative than the Chinese.
So does the UN or the US have any clear perspective on what should happen?
First of all, the UN, right now, the pandemic, I think, has overtaken everybody's attention. But the UN has not weighed in on the India-China border dispute at all, in part because you've got China on the Security Council. You've got the US in the Security Council. India is not in the Security Council, obviously, and therefore there's not much that that is going to be able to be done without Chinese agreement. On the other hand, neither China nor India want a third party involved. Particularly on this, China would not want anybody else. So Donald Trump, has actually did make a comment, I think at the end of May, where he said things are blowing up in India-China relations. They're beating each other up, and I'm here to help if they want. Neither of them took that, and especially I think at this point, China would be hardly interested in that. And even though India is moving closer and closer to the US, they also don't like to internationalize their disputes. So I think the international input into this whole thing will be little. However, looking ahead geopolitically, I think it's a different story, and how the international partners and the international community might actually come in on this question. Bob, I can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Oh, how about now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
All right, sorry about that. I think the fix for the prior problem was to turn the mic off and on in between my speaking, but I forgot to turn it on. Anyway,
good.
So this conflict could certainly be at the center of China's relationship with the world, depending how it plays out. What options are there for moving forward? What do you personally think, or if there is one, on term long-term outcomes might be, and importantly, what's between what each side can accept or do? We mentioned before that India will show the map on the western things like that, where India's at the table and China's not, and so that sort of limits what options there are. So what options are there for moving forward, and what's going to happen, basically?
Yeah, this is really the million-dollar question in some sense. As I said, I think what we can hope to expect at the best is a kind of minor adjustments along the border, basically a return to a status quo ante, because this whole standoff started in May, and they had been having small clashes along the entire that region in the Galvan Valley area and further south. But now, of course, there are areas which China has ingressed into, and the question is whether or not you're going to disengage or not. So that's going to be the number one thing, is going to be trying to get it back to the status quo ante. And to some extent, I think it's going to be sort of a face-saving move at minimum, because, as I said before, the idea that so far what's happening is that you have a clash, you talk, you disengage. But in the process of disengaging, you might actually have another clash, which is exactly what on June 16th apparently happened. That they had an agreement in place on June 6th to disengage and withdraw, and they have this mechanism for clarifying it and for checking it. And the Indians claimed that that is what they were doing clarifying and checking because they didn't see it being withdrawn, and so then the deadly clash occurred. So I'm what they can do at minimum is simply what they've said now. They had a marathon session on the commanders, four commanders on both sides on June 22nd. They have agreed to withdraw. From the Chinese side, the reports were that this is a way to cool down the situation, and the Indian side said that the outcome was positive. So both sides are making the right noises. The real question will be whether they're going to be able to actually get to a point of withdrawing and readjusting in a way that's satisfactory to both. They said they're going to start with the area that they had the biggest clash in Galvan, but there are other areas that they've said they're not going to deal with right now. And that's leaving it wide open for the next round. And so what are you going to be able to give up? I think ultimately the question is going to be that, as I said, India is playing catch up on the border infrastructure. And I think China is going to now, they had certain big advantages. They don't want to give that up. And so it's going to be a push and shove. And when you look at the capabilities, what they're building up, China does have light tanks and armored personal carriers and so on that are very good at high-range mountain warfare. And so the recipe is there and getting thicker for a more deadly conflict as the capabilities go up. Doesn't mean that they want it. I'm not saying that the intentions are to engage in a war. Capabilities sometimes end up having this sort of spiral effect. And so I'm not really very optimistic, except to say that I think they will disengage and get beyond it, but they're going to leave a trail of mistrust and even harder path to get to where they to come at resolution of this stuff.
So, do you think India would enter into a full-scale conflict to protect its territory if it were encroached upon more significantly?
The short answer is I don't think that either side is going to let it get to that point. Now you have to remember both are nuclear states. By the way, no one has mentioned that, the whole nuclear arms situation, because it is in one sense one of the stabilizing factors in the sense that neither side both sides have a no first use policy. And I think they're quite clear on that. And what is amazing is that there has not been, over all these decades, that nuclear shadow hasn't been that strong, unlike India's other neighbor that it has a conflict with, Pakistan. So that's very, very different. So we're talking about very different kind of states. We're talking about different type of leaderships. I think there's the pragmatic leaders on both sides. We've seen that they've held the peace for 50 years, and the hope is that they're going to find a way to maintain that. And I think that it's really kind of unthinkable about a wider conflict, at least for the moment. Both sides have a deep interest in continuing to grow as an economic power, right? I think if on both sides today, the priority would be for India to achieve a developed country status and for China to keep growing, to be able to, become, and that's really their legitimacy is based on that. So I think the idea that wider conflict, having said that, I think India would be preparing for a wider conflict, should it happen, which perhaps they may not have taken as seriously until now.
Yeah, it sounds like between the encroachment into new areas that China previously has not gone into, plus the corridor between China and Pakistan being economically reinforced. Yet, it sounds like there's a lot of very deliberate going on the Chinese side. Also, the PLA and the Communist Party of China in general are not known for off-the-cuff decision-making. That doesn't mean that there can't be accidents or, groups on the border that make their own decisions, but they're typically not known for that, and so it would seem that there is a move to make attention it, keep the wire taut, so to speak, and that India would have to take that seriously, at least take it seriously to make preparations. If they don't, that would be a signal to China to shorten it.
Well, the problem here is, of course, that as you build up the capability, the question is, India would say that it's a defensive buildup. And given the fact that it is the much weaker country, both economically and militarily, China is 5 times, its economy is 5 times the size of India's. Militarily spending is 3 times size. So from the Indian side, it's about filling that gap, the power asymmetry. But from the Chinese side, of course, they don't want to be challenged. And so as they become more and more powerful, their interests grow in the area, and if you try to extrapolate from what the Chinese are doing elsewhere, it is that they've perhaps entered a new phase, which is more assertive. And they're willing to push much harder than they have in the past. And therefore, countries like India and others may have to be preparing for something, a new phase. And that's what I meant about the turning point. India really cannot afford this kind of adventure, in a sense. They're 15 to 20 years behind China in terms of growth. So I think it's going to be a tough decision, but they're going to have to come to a realistic assessment of what is possible, how far you can push this, and what you might do to make up for your weakness. And one of those things, by the way, is moving much closer to Western democracies and the United States. This is the one thing that the Chinese have wanted to avoid, to push India into the arms of the US. And I think, Xi Jinping, the Chinese leadership, I think, has miscalculated here, because if anything could have pushed India, which is very obsessed about strategic autonomy, if anything could have pushed it into the United States side of the ledger in a big way, it's something like this. So I think the Chinese will also have to calibrate and figure out how to avoid that happening for good. But then that would be a big problem for them.
That's fascinating. 2 questions. Time. We'll see how the answers are. One is from an audience member named Patrick, who asked about historical Chinese encroachments into other Indian regions. And he references things from quite a while ago, like under the Qing dynasty, there was a westward campaign. And I guess the question is there collective memory in India about things from that long ago, or are they?
I'm having a little trouble hearing your.
Sorry, Bob. I'm going to jump in just because your audio is pretty much cutting out and we can't hear you. So Deepa, we have some Q&A. We have two questions that we want to get to from the audience. And the first one's from Patrick. And his question is, do historical Chinese encroachments into other Indian regions play a role into the current situation? For example, do the Qing dynasty's westward campaigns against the Gurkhas, I believe that's how it's pronounced, under Qinglong play a role in the collective memory of Indians in this dispute?
The collective memory is long, but I think it essentially goes back mostly to 1962 war, which is one big turning point. But prior to that, of course, Indian analysts and others that know the subject do feel that that one of the big problems has been that the Qing dynasty and the British colonialists couldn't come to an agreement on this. And one of the ways the Qing dynasty did this was to simply ignore the British suggestions and for an agreement along the border. And that's one of the reasons that we have this ambiguous situation. I think most Indians are much more familiar with the 62 war and what is seen as a humiliation because of the way in which it was a surprise attack and it was left, really punished India and with China holding on to Aksai Chin. So that's really the memory. So it's a modern sort of post-independence memory. But the other thing is that certain level of hypocrisy is seen on the Chinese side because they don't accept the British lines on the western side, but on the eastern side, while they disagree with India on what is called the McMahon line, they accept it with Myanmar. So there is that sort of particular push on the, on India. And yeah, one point on that, just to add, is that why is that the case? And it may be that going back, Bob, to your first question on the ambiguous nature of the border, it's partly could be to keep India off balance,
okay.
not resolve the border, because if you can do it with 13 of your neighbors, why not the 14th?
That makes sense. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of the hour. We're going to ask one more question from the audience before we close it out. And this last question is, there seems to be a moderate increase of nationalism in China, which may or may not take part in the CCP's calculations, in some of these border tensions. But you mentioned previously that India has really felt this was a big blow to the nation as well. How does Indian nationalism play into the country's response to this future incident? Another audience member asked about the boycott movement of China. Okay. Do you mind answering that?
Yeah, sure. I think as I said, there's kind of an asymmetry here. Nationalism on both sides have been up in recent years, partly because of the kind of leaders you have on both sides. Narendra Modi, very much of a strong nationalist, Xi Jinping, but I think on the Chinese side, the nationalism is playing out more in places like Hong Kong, where the National Security Act, and also pressurizing Taiwan with military jets flying around and so forth. So that's a pressure point there. The nationalism, I think, from the Chinese side is not so much on India, but the Indian side, there is indeed a great deal more. And Prime Minister Modi has, in some sense, painted himself into a little bit of a corner because he is very big on muscular talk about the neighbors and protecting sovereignty and so forth. But at this point, he's trying to play it down. And so he's been called out by a lot of people on social media for that. But this is where I think Mr. Modi has been much more nationalist against Pakistan than against China, just because he's a realist as well. But the boycott China movement, okay, so I saw a couple of quick surveys of that. And, one question was, would you support a boycott of Chinese products for 1 year? And about 85% apparently said yes. However, another survey asked whether or not you would, and this is on a lighter note, whether you'd be willing to uninstall TikTok app. And there you had a whole different view. Only 21% said they, 21% they said they would not. And 65% said maybe, and 11% that they would. So, the TikTok factor was a little bit more. When it comes down to it, are they willing to take these kind of actions that, but the government itself has taken at least made some moves about taking a second look at engineering firms from China doing business with Indian Railroad. They had a contract, and I think they're looking at it again. That's a big deal. Same with telecom, with India's BSNL. They're also taking a look at that. That's a lot of, those are big contracts that could be lost. So boycott, maybe not at a big level, but certainly strategic key sectors, I think you will see some reactions. And that will be something that the Indian government can hold up and say, look what we've done.
Wow. So yeah, that's really interesting on the technology front versus the goods front, how people's opinions interact there. Okay, well, thank you so much, Deepa. We really appreciate your time and your expertise in sharing this important, information that people are confused about. This is coming out, and maybe some of our audience who is pretty familiar with China but not as familiar with India, and learning more about these things. I just want to thank you for your time and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah. Just a few things before we end the event. For all of you that we didn't get to your questions, sorry about that. We just ran out of time. If we have some time to answer them later on, we're going to have a follow-up email with this event. It'll have a video of this event as well as some other important information, as well as a link to Deepa and some of her links, as well as her books and information. You guys can check out that and learn more about her in that email. We are having another event tomorrow that is about the post-consumer in China. That's going to be tomorrow with Michael Chu and Stephen Roach. So if you're interested and you enjoy these types of events and you want to learn a little bit more, please feel free to join us at that event tomorrow. It's going to be at 5 p.m. Eastern time. You sign up through the same channels. And if you're interested in SupChina and you want to learn more about what we do and our information and get a weekly briefing, we have a free weekly briefing that comes out every Monday. It just is the top news that's happening in China in the past week. It's really informative and we keep on top of these stories. And if you're interested in an even deeper dive, we do a SupChina Access, which is our membership. And that gives you a daily newsletter with just the most current updated news on China. So thank you for all of you that attended. Thanks again to Deepa. Thanks for Bob. Sorry for the audio problems. We appreciate all of your participation and we hope to see you at a future event. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Jerry. Bye-bye.